Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could join us. Um, as I mentioned just a moment ago, my name is Scott Kane. I'm joined by a number of folks from the department. Um, Today, I'm going to be taking a look at the E-rate for new CIOs, which means that basically you're going to get a high-level view of the program. That having been said, for those who have already had experience in E-rate, I will say that a lot of this is going to be review for you at best. I don't think there will be much in the way of any new material. That having been said, you're obviously welcome to be here, and we're glad that you could join us. For those of you who have not been a part of or not done anything with E-rate, you're new to E-rate. This is going to be probably feeling a lot like the proverbial trying to take a drink from a fire hose. There will be a lot that comes at you in the next hour or so. So you may get a feeling of being a little overwhelmed, and that's fine. That's really to be expected. As I mentioned a moment ago, as you go forward and dive into your own E-rate adventures, Caprice and myself and your CETS engineers who are all well versed in the E-rate program, we're all here to support you in this process. So as questions arise during your E-rate adventures, certainly want to encourage you to reach out to any of us to help provide support and guidance in your navigating the program. So without further ado, I am going to move in to presentation. And, well, all right. There we go. All right, so as just a quick overview of the agenda, what we're going to take a look at during the course of the day here, we'll talk about the E-rate program from a very, very high level, where it came from, what does it do, who's involved, those kinds of things. We'll talk about some of the basic concepts. We'll look at eligibility for the program. All of you that are here have some sort of eligibility for the program as K-12 districts. So we'll discuss, what is and what isn't eligible, who is and who isn't eligible and the circumstances around those. We'll look a little bit at the process of figuring out how much funding you might be eligible for via a look at discount data. And then we'll look at we'll take a look at the E-rate Productivity Center, which is where you will spend most of your time as you move through and navigate the E-rate program. So, as an overview, what is E-rate and who makes the rules? Well, this whole thing started back in 1996 when Congress enacted the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which directed the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to establish the E-rate program, along with three others: Lifeline, Rural Health, and High Cost. We won't get into the details of those at all, but the fourth is the schools and libraries, and that's the E-rate program. That's what E-rate refers to as the schools and libraries portion of the Universal Service Program, again, that was enacted in 1996. Just as a quick aside, those of you who have been around a little while, such as myself, you may recall that in 1996, part of that act was actually the breaking up of the old Ma Bell. You might remember the Bell Communications, AT&T back in the day, was absolutely a monster that had both local and long distance, and really had a monopoly that actually got broken up during under that legislation. And as a part of that, the Universal Service Program was enacted. So that legislation gives the FCC oversight into the program. The FCC issues orders that set the rules and policies for the program and gives direction to the Universal Service Administrative Company. USAC is responsible for the day-to-day operations and administration of the E-rate program. USAC is the organization that you will in all likelihood, and for the vast majority of things, be interacting with. It is rare that you would get to the point where you're actually interacting with FCC personnel. So I, I skipped, forgive me, I skipped what is E-rate. E-rate is ultimately a discount program. It provides support funding so that schools and libraries can more affordably access and acquire telecommunication services. Now, when we say telecommunication services, you might think that that would include voice services. Voice services were an original part of the program, but they were phased out in 2019. So really what we're talking about when we talk about telecommunications is we're talking about data transmission and internet access, and then some of the components which make those services possible. We'll talk about that in a little bit, in a little bit more detail here in just a few moments. So E-rate is a discount program. It is established through the Telecommunications Act. The rules are set by the FCC, and those rules are propagated and enforced and put into play by the Universal Service Administrative Company, USAC, who operates the program on a day-to-day basis. There's an application process. There's a step-by-step that you will have to go through in order to acquire the funding to support your telecommunications services. That process in a very high level, and this is, to be perfectly honest, skipping some serious details, but we'll look at a few of those as we go along. But there is a general annual process that you will go through as you apply for and receive your funding. It starts with a competitive bidding process. One of the key components of the E-rate program is that all of the services that you acquire funding for to support or that you get support from E-rate for require that those services be competitively bid. It is a linchpin of the program. Failure to meet the competitive bidding rules and it will result in denial of funding or rescission of funding, or perhaps even them coming back to you and requiring that those funds be returned. So needless to say, the competitive bidding aspect of this is incredibly important. That competitive bidding process is reflected in your first form. The first form that you will submit is a Form 470. The Form 470 essentially tells the world what services you are looking for. Now, these are the services we need. These are the capabilities. You might have an RFP that would go along with that. You may or may not, depending upon what services you're seeking and the complexity thereof. But you will submit that Form 470 in the E-rate Productivity Center, which we will take a look at later. The next step, once you've completed your competitive bidding process, you will say to the world what services you're looking for. The world will respond to you with bids that you will then go through an evaluation process, and you'll select a winner of that competitive bidding process. Once that is done, you will then apply for discounts. You'll know exactly how much money it's going to cost you, and then how much money you would be eligible for under the program. So you'll apply for discounts using the Form 471. Pardon me. Once we get to filing your Form 471 will go through a review process. You may have some interaction with USAC personnel during that process. There are a number of steps along the way where you may receive reviews or requests for additional information. That is a normal part of the process. So just be aware that there is some iterative aspects to this process. It's not just simply you submit it and you get you automatically get the funding. They do make a funding decision based upon a review of your application. Assuming that your application is approved and funding is set aside or committed, to your project, then services will begin, and you indicate to USAC that your services have commenced via the Form 486. So you go through the funding year, and after filing your Form 486, and at the end of the year, you get to the point where now it's time for reimbursement. Reimbursement can happen in two different ways. It can happen via the Form 472 or the Form 474. Now, both of those are forms that are used to invoice USAC, but they are different in the sense that the Form 472, also known as a BEAR form, the Billed Entity Applicant Reimbursement Form, is filed by you, the applicant. And this is used in a situation where you would have paid in full for your services. The Form 474, on the other hand, is filled out and submitted by the service provider and would be used in a situation where the service provider has issued to you, the applicant, pre-discounted bills. So they'll take your percentage off, and then they seek reimbursement from USAC via the Form 474. And for what it's worth, we'll talk about this in a little bit. You actually have the choice as to whether you're going to invoice USAC yourself or have your service provider do that for themselves, and you receive a reduced bill to begin with up front. There we go. So to look at these a little bit closer, the Form 470, you're going to, this is your competitive bidding process. You run an open and fair competitive bidding process. Now, what does open and fair mean? Well, generally speaking, that means that all potential service providers have the same information so that they can all be essentially equal in terms of their in terms of their knowledge of your project, so that nobody has an unfair competitive advantage. That's the key, is just making sure that no one has a competitive advantage. Now, that can be something as simple as someone has one or two bits of information that others don't. So it's really, really important in the long run that you make sure that if, for example, during your competitive bidding process, let's say you've got an RFP out on the street, that you get a question from one of your service providers, and you provide the answer to that response, and it might include a clarification about an aspect of your RFP. You want to make sure that all of the potential bidders to your project also have that information. Now, we'll talk about we'll get into the real details about this when we talk about, during the Form 470 training. We'll get into the details and some weeds about that process and the various steps that you would need to take in order to meet that requirement. That having been said, just know that you are expected to do everything that you can within reason to operate a fair and open competitive bidding process. You'll file the Form 470, and then you are required to wait for 28 days before you select a service provider. You will, after that 28 days, you then use some sort of bid evaluation matrix. Basically, it's like a rubric for those of you who have spent time perhaps in the classroom or in the education world. You basically use a rubric or a matrix that you will assign points to various aspects of the bids that you are evaluating, and then you'll select a winner. Now, that having been said, the important thing to note is that the price of, or the total cost of the bid is, or excuse me, of the project must be, or of the response, I should say, of the bid response, must be the most heavily weighted or primary factor in your considerations. But Also worthy of note is the fact that it's only the primary factor. It does not have to be the only thing that you evaluate. Obviously, when it comes to things like, I don't know, let's say routers and switches, there are compatibility issues that you need to be obviously taken care of to make sure that the things that you are purchasing will fit into your network environment. So price, while it is the most heavily weighted factor or the primary factor of evaluation, it is not the only one.
We have a
Yes.
question in the chat.
Okay.
Justin Spinks is asking, is this a process that must be repeated every year?
That depends upon the contract that you establish. The 470 process is used to establish a contract, but you can establish a multi-year contract. So if you establish a multi-year contract through that Form 470 process, you do not need to file a new Form 470 each year. That 470 will be active and valid for the period of time that is associated with that contract. If, however, you only establish a 1-year contract, then yes, you would need to go through this process on a yearly basis. Good question, Justin. Thank you. The next step in the process is going to be after you've conducted your competitive bidding process and you've identified a winner, you will move on to filing the Form 471. This is where you're going to provide information about your requests, the discount level that you are eligible for, the costs of services, the service provider that you've selected, the details about the service themselves. For example, if we're talking about connectivity, they'll want to know what kind of line speeds, whether there are various other components to that, firewalls, et cetera, excuse me, et cetera, that they will ask you about on your Form 470. You submit the Form 470. They will ask you some review questions in all likelihood. Occasionally, you'll submit a Form 471, and they'll look at it and say, yep, that's exactly what we would expect to see, and they won't have any additional questions, and then they will issue you a funding commitment decision. But in all likelihood, you'll probably get a question or two from every Form 470 that you, or excuse me, for every Form 471 that you submit. Once you start services, you need to tell USAC that those services have started, and you need to verify that you are in compliance with the Children's Internet Protection Act, also referred to as CIPA. This is accomplished via the Form 486. It is rare that you'll receive questions about your Form 486, but it does happen occasionally. So be aware that, again, as I mentioned, just about at any step of the process, you may receive inquiries about various forms that you submit in this E-rate process. The Form 486 is, for what it's worth, rather simple. It just takes a few minutes to go in online in the E-rate Productivity Center and fill it out and submit it. At the end of the process, so you've submitted your Form 486, your services have started, the services are now being delivered, and let's say that, for example, at the end of the year, you've paid for all of your services. It's time to get your money back, or obtain the money that you are eligible for. It starts with the submission of a Form 498. Now, we put this on here only because you just need to be aware of the fact that there is a Form 498 out there that provides banking information to USAC so that they know where to send the money. It is all done electronically. There are no actual checks that are cut. Thank goodness. Those of you who've been around for a while remember the days where there was money that was, first of all, it was back then, it was shuttled over to the service provider, and then you had to go to your service. If you had paid money, or you had paid your bills in full, you actually had to deal with the service provider to get your money back. from the money you were eligible from them. None of that is the case anymore. If a bear is filed by an applicant, the money goes to the applicant. If a SPY is submitted by a service provider, that money goes directly to the service provider. It is all electronic transfer, and really that Form 498 is just the electronic transfer information, so that USAC knows where to send the money. So you pay your bill, again, either in full or the discounted bill that you receive from your service provider. It is fairly common to receive questions about your bear form. And you want to make sure that any USAC questions that come out of that, you respond to very quickly, because usually those you are only given 7 days to respond to questions about your bear forms. Again, the same kind of thing on the Form 474, only the 474, the SPY form, the service provider invoice, is submitted by the service provider rather than by you. You still may receive questions about the service provider invoice. So just because the SPY is filled out by the service provider doesn't mean you're necessarily done with the process associated with the particular funding year that you're working on. All right, so there's some basic concepts, some basic ideas about which you need to be aware, and we'll take a look at them. We'll talk about eligibility. We'll look at a funding year and how that funding year breaks down. We'll look at the filing window, which is the time period during which you file the Form 470, and then how the other forms get filed around that funding window or filing window. We'll look at, we'll look at identifying numbers. We'll talk about funding requests, and then we'll look at how do you calculate the discount for which your district is eligible. So we'll start with eligibility, and we'll talk about who is eligible. Now, when we say who, we're really talking about what entities, and we're really talking about schools here. We could talk about libraries, but we have a separate group of folks that work at Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives, and they are assisting the libraries, so we don't need to talk about libraries necessarily, but generally schools and libraries are eligible for E-rate. When we talk about schools, a school that's eligible must provide elementary and or secondary education as determined under state law. You cannot have an endowment exceeding 50 million, and you cannot operate as a for-profit business. Now, I don't think those last two things are particularly pertinent to Kentucky schools because, well, I think all of us on this call anyway are public K-12 schools and do not obviously then operate as a for-profit business. And I am not aware of anyone in the state that has more than, or a public school that has an endowment in excess of 50 million. So, but as far as a school is concerned, it is important to note that schools, as defined under the state law, must provide elementary and or secondary education in order to be eligible for E-rate. There's also eligible users. In the Commonwealth, the eligibility of students is limited to K-12. This is a result of the way that that funding is provided to, and definitions that are established by state law do not include pre-K and adult ed students based upon, again, the state law and that is pertinent to defining those roles. Those things are reviewed by USAC. Those eligibility kinds of things will not really change, and you really have no control over them because it's based upon state law. So state law would have to change in order for these eligibility requirements to change. So basically, you just need to make sure that you're thinking about kindergarten through 12, pre-K, and anything beyond 12 is not eligible as a user. And it's important to note that ineligible users may end up using some of your services that are supported by E-rate, which will mean that you would need to do some sort of allocation, or what they refer to as cost allocation, which means that you're going to reduce the amount of funding that you're asking for if those services ultimately get used not only by eligible students, but by ineligible students. We will talk about that in detail during the Form 471 training. There's also eligibility for non-school, that is, buildings that do not provide direct instruction, but also do support the educational environment. So things like places like facilities like a board office, transportation, field houses, warehouses, network operation centers. And these, it's not an exhaustive list by any means. So if you have other buildings that don't fall under these 5 items or these 5 classifications, as long as that building is operated in a manner that provides support to the educational process within the district in some fashion, it is considered a non-instructional facility, and it is eligible for certain discounts. That is basically your data transmission and internet access. We'll talk about some of the distinctions about those things in a little bit. So we'll talk about services. What services are eligible for support? Eligible services are broken down into 2 categories. And what do you know? We've actually referred to them as Category 1 and Category 2. The service type, there's only one service type under Category 1, and that is data transmission or internet access. Now, I think for the vast majority of Kentucky schools, you're really only going to be looking at data transmission rather than internet access. That's because your KEN connection provides you with the internet access. So in most cases, when you all go to file for E-rate support, you're going to be looking for support for data transmission services that moves the ones and zeros from the network operations center, where there's your handoff from the KEN connection to your district, out to satellite schools or other non-instructional facilities. As mentioned previously, voice services were phased out completely in 2019. Then there are Category 2 services. Category 2 services include things like equipment needed to make those broadband connections within your schools and libraries, well, your schools anyway, to make those functional. This would include things like, and there's 3 service types: internal connections, basic maintenance of internal connections, and then managed internal broadband services. We'll talk about a couple of examples of those in just a moment. Category 1 services are not limited in cost as long as you are able to establish that they are cost effective. So in other words, there's no specific budget cap on how much money you can request for Category 1 services. For Category 2 services, however, there is a budget. There is a 5-year budget that is provided to each eligible district that is based upon the number of students in the school in the district. That 5-year budget and that 5-year amount of money is established again based upon your average daily attendance, your ADA, and then you are able to spend out of that budget over the course of that 5-year period. I believe we are going into the 2025 year is the final year of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. It is the final year of the current 5-year budget cycle. So following about a year from now, they will be recalculating and establishing a new budget for the next 5-year period. So It may be important for some of you to review your category budget or category 2 budget currently to determine if there are funds available. Again, especially if you are new to this, you're going to want to take a look at your category 2 budget and see if you have any remaining. That information is available within Epic. I won't show you specifically now where it is, but when we get to 470 and 471 trainings, we will take a look at where to identify those things, or excuse me, where to find that information. And if you have questions about that as you go forward, you can always drop a line to Caprice and myself or your KE, and we'll be happy to help you point you in the right direction. I know that KEs are pretty active in terms of reviewing that on behalf of their districts, and then are regularly in communication about that budget so that they can help you maximize the effectiveness of that budget and utilize it to the fullest extent, which obviously we want to take advantage of as much as possible. So examples of Category 1 services: leased lit or dark fiber. Under certain circumstances, there may be support for district-owned fiber as well. If you are interested in district-owned fiber that you don't have currently, make sure that you get in touch with your KE and myself and Caprice so that we can talk about those, because that gets pretty complicated and needs to be addressed sort of in a very one-on-one kind of fashion. Also eligible under Category 1, wireless services, satellite service. Again, this is all connectivity. We're basically talking about transfer of ones and zeros and access to the internet itself, T1s, T3s, DSL, and under limited conditions, network equipment can be eligible for Category 1. Most network equipment that you'll be purchasing will probably be purchased under Category 2. Examples of Category 2 services: again, there are those 3 categories of service, and it will be important to know from your Category 2, when you go to file for Category 2 services and equipment, you need to know under which of these service types your request falls. So when we talk about internal connections, we're talking about routers, switches, wireless access points, controllers, UPSs, the licenses for controllers, the seat licenses for access to the wire access points. Those are all going to be falling under internal connections. Wiring projects themselves, to put wires into or replace old wiring in a building, that would all fall under internal connections. You also have managed internal broadband services, also known as MIBs. This is a third-party monitoring and management service, and they are basically looking at and constantly working on or looking at and monitoring your network functions to make sure that everything is up and running as it should be. And then there's basic maintenance of eligible internal connections. So those internal connections, that first bullet point, anything that falls under there, if you need break fix services or you have a contract with a supplier of break fix services, you can get E-rate support to help cover the cost of that. Just be aware that those basic maintenance services, E-rate support is limited only to actual work performed. Sometimes folks will purchase a contract with a service provider, and they're basically sort of on call for you, and you pay them whether or not they actually deliver service. Based on that contract, they're there as your backup, so to speak, your maintenance backup. If they don't provide actual service under that contract, you get no E-rate support. You only get E-rate support if they come out and actually do work, and you'll need to make sure that you obtain from them an invoice that shows the actual work performed and how much of an overall contract those costs represent. On an annual basis, the FCC issues a list of services that are eligible for the upcoming funding year. For example, right now there is uh, a funding year 2025 ESL that has not yet been approved, but the draft is out there. And you use this ESL to guide what it is that you are selecting, excuse me, what it is you are applying for, and what it is that you want to get E-rate support for. So be aware that there can be some changes to that on a yearly basis. Um, Changes are usually pretty small, although this year is an exception to that. There are a couple of things that have been added by the FCC in terms of eligible services that are new. So this year's ESL is going to be a little bit different. It's going to have some added services around providing hotspots for loaner programs to deliver a loaner hotspot to students or staff that do not have internet access at home. That's been added to the options under the telecommunication services.
Scott, we have a
Yes,
question.
yes.
Stella Pollard is asking, where can we find that draft? She's asking where we can find the draft.
The draft, I think if you just search, do a Google search for E-rate eligible services list, you can do that, or you can just go to.
We'll work on that and get that in the chat while you're
Yeah,
talking,
actually,
Scott.
if you want to just drop that in the chat, that'd be great.
We'll find that. Yep, thanks.
It's on the USAC website. If you go just to the E-rate website, it's usac.org/E-rate, and then use their search function for ESL or eligible services list. You'll the search results will give you access to that page. All right, so the funding year. What is the funding year and how does that operate? Well, all E-rate funding years, and I've noticed as we've been going along that I've said FY on a lot of these things, and I need to go back and change those to EFY because I use the E to refer to an E-rate funding year so that there's a little less confusion, because the E-rate funding year is a funding year that starts on July 1st and runs either 12 or 15 months. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But that funding year is referenced by the year in which that period starts. Okay, the E-rate funding year, when we talk about E-rate funding year 2024, the one that we are currently in, you note that it starts July 1 of 2024. This is the opposite of the fiscal year, which references the year's end. Fiscal year 2024 was the year that ended on June 30th of 2024. This can be a little confusing, particularly when you start working with your financial folks who think in terms of fiscal years rather than funding years. So just be aware that that can cause confusion. All right. So that's why I put the E in front of FY, because oftentimes folks will see FY and they think fiscal year rather than funding or E-rate funding year. So that's why I put the E there. Category 1 funding year is 12 months. It starts July 1 and ends June 30 the following. Category 2 funding, the funding year is for 15 months. It starts on July 1 and ends September 30 the following year, calendar year. So that you get a full 15 months in order to implement your Category 2 projects, as opposed to Category 1, which is just 12 months. In terms of the timing of the program activities, competitive bidding, Form 470, and applying for the Form 470 for applying for funding or discounts, your Form 471 always occurs before the funding year begins. Competitive bidding forms, your Forms 470 are usually available a full year prior to the commencement of the funding year. Now, this year's been a bit of an exception, but that is as a result of some things that have been added to the Form 470, that they had to get the form revised, and then they had to get Office of Budget and Management approval for their new form, so it took a little bit longer to get the new Form 470 posted. But that Form 470, generally speaking, July 1 prior to the year beginning. So, for example, 2026, you'll probably see the new Form 470 for 2026 being available July 1st of 2025, unless there's some new additions. But anyway, those two will always occur before the funding year the funding year starts. The Form 471 will usually be available somewhere in the January timeframe. We'll talk about that, I think, a little bit here in a second. The Form 486 is submitted. Sometimes it is submitted a little bit before the funding year begins. Sometimes it's submitted after the funding year begins. But the Form 486 is dependent upon you having received a funding commitment decision. That is basically a response to your submitting the Form 471. That decision, once that is made and issued to you, then it is time for you to file the Form 486. So depending upon, I think you have 120, actually I don't think, I know you have 120 days from the issue date of the funding commitment decision letter, which you'll hear us refer to as the FCDL. Once you get an FCDL, you have 120 days to file the Form 486, and begin your project. Projects are implemented and purchases made. You're indicating basically that your project is being implemented, is that the services are being delivered. And then last but certainly not least, the invoicing for reimbursement. Although this can be done at any time after services have been delivered and paid for, generally this occurs after the end of the funding year. As long as services have been paid for in full, you can begin the invoicing process at any time after, after those services have been delivered and paid for. Services generally start at the beginning of the funding year, although there are exceptions for equipment that is needed to make data transmission services functional. But I think I sort of alluded to this already, that your services start at the beginning of the funding year, and particularly for your recurring services, things like data transmission, and those kinds of things are going to be delivered during the funding year. You do have the option under Category 2 to begin to implement your project a little bit early if need be. And we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit here in just a moment. As mentioned, invoicing can occur during the funding year as long as you've paid for and received, or I should say in reverse order there, you've received and paid for the services in question. Recurring services must be delivered during the funding year. That is to say that your monthly internet access or your monthly cost for data transmission services, those services must be delivered within the funding year. Note that though the non-recurring services, for example, equipment installations, will generally be installed up through the September 30th following the close of the funding year. That is a deadline that can be extended under certain circumstances. We say either automatically or by request. Automatically, it will happen if you receive a very late funding commitment decision. That does occasionally happen, and when that does happen, you will receive an automatic extension for delivery of services. It can also be requested. When you are requesting one, you will need to be able to justify why it is that the services weren't delivered during the original funding, during the original funding year. Delivery and installation can sometimes start before the funding year, but it can occur no earlier than April 1st prior. Again, this is going to be primarily Category 2, delivery and installation of, let's say, for example, you've got wireless access points, routers, switches, those pieces of equipment that fall under Category 2. Those can be implemented and installed earlier up to as early as April 1st, ahead of the funding year, primarily because you want to make sure that that's in place so that your recurring services can be delivered throughout the funding year without interruption or having to wait for installation of some of those pieces of critical equipment. So the filing window, what is the filing window and when does it occur? The filing window refers to the period of time during which you can file a Form 471. It is a very specific period of time. It is usually somewhere in the neighborhood of about 75 days, and it usually opens in early to mid-January and will close in mid to late March in advance of the funding year. So we are getting close to, or closing in shortly on the 2025 471 filing window. I do expect that there's no reason to think that there will be a change to this timing or this time frame that they usually use. So somewhere probably in the next 30 days or so, I would expect that you'll hear an announcement from USAC letting you know what those specific dates are, but they have not yet been announced. They are announced on an annual basis, usually in the fall prior to that funding window. Applications that are filed outside of the filing window, your Forms 471, filed outside of the filing window are not considered for funding. There is an exception to this. I'm not going to get into it because you would be unwise to rely upon anything other than you making sure that you submit your Form 471 inside the funding window. If for whatever reason you might be having to submit one late, you need to make sure that you get in touch with myself, Caprice, or your KEs, and let's have a conversation about that. And let's have that conversation before the end of the filing window. So it is really, really important to make sure that you stay on top of the Form 471 process. Critical numbers. What do you need to know about these identifying numbers? Well, there's a couple of different numbers that you'll need to be aware of. One is that each applicant entity is assigned an entity number. The district, as a parent entity, and we'll use that parent term I think you'll understand in just a moment, has an assigned entity number. This is generally referred to as the billed entity number. The district usually receives the bills for all of their schools. Even if a service is provided only at one particular school, the district is usually the recipient of that, and so they are the billed entity, generally speaking. The BEN, or the billed entity number, refers to the parent entity, that is the district itself. District-owned buildings or locations where instructional or educational support services are provided, a child entity of the parent district, and where E-rate support services are delivered should also have an entity number. It's just referred to as an entity number rather than a billed entity number. So, I mentioned those like bus garages and warehouses, a field house where you deliver internet services. Any of those need to have their own entity number, as well as schools. Obviously, your schools are going to have an entity number as well. Any place where instruction is delivered and E-rate support is also received, those entities need to have an entity number. And entity numbers for any new facilities can be obtained from USAC via a customer service case in Epic, which we'll talk about the E-rate Productivity Center here in just a moment, or a phone call. Another important identifying number is the SPIN, or the Service Provider Identification Number. It's a number that's assigned to the service providers that participate in the E-rate program. And these service providers, it's important to note, may have more than one SPIN due to a number of different things. Different business units or service areas. A service provider might have a SPIN for each of those service areas that you have. For example, AT&T, for example, has, various subsets, with Bell South and a few others. They have DBAs, or they're doing business as. So each of those might have its own spin. Mergers and acquisitions, is another example where you might have one company that's got its own spin purchases another company, and but they continue to do business under that original name. So now that new or that the company that acquired the other one now basically has two different spins, and which one you use will be important, very, very important, I might add. And whoops, there we go. Sorry. And so it's important to be in touch with your service provider to make sure that you are using the correct service provider identification number on any forms that request it. That's primarily going to be on the Form 471. Now, discounts. How do you know how much discount you are eligible for? Discounts depend upon two different pieces of information. One is the level of poverty that's in the school, in your school district, or the area that your school district serves. This is reflected, or this is actually identified using National School Lunch Program eligibility. Basically, you're going to look at how many of your students are eligible for NSLP, and that's going to be used as a proxy to represent the level of need within the school district. The other aspect that is going to be taken into account is the urban or rural status of the school district. Whether there's a recognition, obviously, that it's oftentimes more expensive to deliver services to rural locations. So in certain instances, rural locations receive a slightly higher discount than do the urban locations. Speaking of urban and rural, individual schools are classified as urban and or rural if, well, in this case, they're classified as urban if it is located in an urbanized area or urban cluster with a population of 25,000 or more. That generally tends to be done by zip code, but there may be some exceptions to that. If you are in a location with fewer than 25,000, then it is considered a rural location. I will say, and that it's important to note that this is basically previously established and set up for you in Epic. You can challenge that, and you can basically appeal to USAC to have a location reclassified as one or the other based on any new information that might come about. Generally speaking, this uses census data. And so we'll only change, generally speaking, every 10 years once new census data is made available to USAC. If somebody could mute that person, that would be helpful. Thank you. But anyway, and again, if you're in an area with more than 25,000 within that zip code, you'll find that that is considered generally urban. Stop. Okay. So there's a discount matrix. Now we're going to look at how does this work. Percentage of eligible student or NSLP eligible students on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you have discount rate for both the urban and the rural. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'm going to take a real quick look at calculating it for yourself just to figure it out. So here's your general matrix. You're going to start by determining the number of students in the school district. That's going to be this data is going to be in some form or another in another about a month or so will be provided to you in terms of the data that is going to be submitted by the state to USAC in support of your applications. We'll talk about discount data in about a month during the training. I highly, highly encourage you, especially for those of you who have not been through that process, but even those who have, please join us for that training as well. It's really a critical piece of this E-rate puzzle to make sure that for a myriad reasons that at the state level, our data is matching up with your data. And we'll talk about that in some specific detail again in about a month during our look at discount data and updating your discount data in Epic. Invitations for those should have come from your CETS engineers. If you haven't seen that yet, please get in touch with either them or myself, and we'll make sure that you get an invitation to those meetings. So you start by determining the number of students in the school district. Then you look at your NSLP eligibility, and you're going to divide the number of students in the district. You'll divide the number of NSLP eligible by the total number of in the district, giving you a percentage. So you have a percentage of students that are eligible, and then you apply it to the matrix. So we'll give a real world example here. South Bend School District is rural, has 1,070 students. Of those 1,070 students, 450 are eligible. That means that 42% of the students are eligible for NSLP. And based on the matrix, with a rural school district with 42% eligible, it qualifies for a 70% E-rate discount. We'll just kind of back up and we'll see this more clearly. That you can see then you follow down the column. On the left-hand side, you have 35 to 49%. We said 42. They are a rural district. So in this case, this example, South Bend School District would be eligible for a 70% discount. Hopefully that makes some sense to you. If it doesn't, we'll be more than happy to have a discussion of it. Another important set of numbers to be aware of are funding request numbers, also referred to as FRNs. The funding request number is generated when you issue a funding request on a Form 470. This number is automatically generated and assigned to that funding request. And be aware that on any given Form 471, there may be more than one FRN, more than one funding request, and therefore more than one funding request number. You will hear us refer to FRNs, funding requests, and funding request numbers sort of interchangeably. If let's say that somebody calls me and has a question about something that they're being asked about by USAC's reviewers, I might ask you, well, what's the FRN? That's going to be, what I'm asking you basically, what's the reference number for the information about that funding request, so that I can look up or somebody else can look up and see what it is that you've requested, how much money you've requested, what details you provided along with it. And then just be aware that I may be referring to a number, or I may be referring to something some detail within that funding request, but you'll hear that referred to as, both of them referred to as FRNs. All right, so let's do a quick introduction to the E-rate Productivity Center. You'll hear us refer to it as EPIC. You can find it. You can find the login at the address provided here, and for what it's worth, we will make this this presentation available along with the video, and so that you can use that direct. You don't have to memorize that or write that down right now. But your district portal is going to be the place where you file your forms, where you request reimbursement, where you respond to most of the inquiries that you would receive. It's where you'll submit customer service cases. You can manage your district and building information. You can update discount calculation data. You submit appeals, you can add users to your portal so that, for example, you can request, or excuse me, you can add, if you have other folks within your district who are also going to be a part of your E-rate filings, that they can be added as users, and then you can manage their permissions within that. I'm going to quick stop sharing so that I can share a different window. And I will share now. There we go. All right. So once you log into your portal, this is what it will look like with a couple of exceptions. It won't have the word training, so I'm using a training environment that USAC provides just as for demonstration purposes. It will have your name, your district's name here at the welcome. You can notice, for one thing, that this welcome is a link. That will take you to an overview page with details about your district. So, for example, if we click on that,
Todd,
yes,
I
we have
don't
a
mean to
question.
interrupt you. Before you go any further,
Sure.
Tracy Griffin is asking how do we receive our login information for Epic?
If you don't have login information for Epic, you will need to call client services at 888 203 8100. And I believe Caprice put that at the top of the chat right as we got started today. So you should be able to just sort of copy paste that and drop that into a sticky note or something so that you've got it easily available. But 888 203 8100. And funny story, I don't know if this is still the case, but back in the day, and when I say back in the day, I mean like 15, almost 20 years ago, um, you had to be really, really careful about whether you used 888 or 800. Uh, you don't want to use the 800 number because it was well, let's just say that you would have gotten something slightly more risque than E-rate. Just put it that way. I don't know that that's the case anymore. I've never actually tried that, but I do know that some people made the mistake early in the day, early in the program, that kind of an amusing thing. That was kind of like the difference between whitehouse.gov versus whitehouse.org back in the day. That, if any of you remember that, one of those was the site that you wanted to get to learn about the president, and the other site was something that didn't really have anything to do with the president, if you know what I mean. Okay, so you can see here that if I clicked on that welcome text where my district name was, it gives me an overview, gives me access to then tabs across the top that allows me to look at my customer service cases. I can look at additional information about my district. This allows me to drill down and look at my entities, look at my discount calculations. I mentioned where you can find your information about Category 2 budget. Right here is one place that you can find that. There's information about your contracts, any forms that you've filled out, appeals that you have either submitted in the past or that are active and waiting for adjudication, news, and then related actions. All of this information related to the overall school district. And for what it's worth, you can drill down to the individual building level and then see a similar set of information about the district as a whole, or excuse me, about those individual schools and those details. We will look very closely at this when we talk about and deal with discount data. You'll note also then that you can, from this location, you can manage user permissions, you can create new users, you can add or remove users, and then you have a whole host of other things. Who is your general contact? A lot of these are creating new forms, but you can access much of this from multiple different locations. From your landing page, the landing page provides you with pretty much everywhere you need to jump off from. Each of these listed up here that mentions a form is where you would start a new version of that form. So if you need to start a new form 470 or 471 or 486, this is where you would click to start a new form. You can issue appeals here. You can request deadline extensions for invoicing to ask for reimbursement. You have a Form 500, which allows you to make changes to funding requests that you've made. You can cancel them, you can reduce them. You can make requests to change your service provider under certain circumstances. You can change the service provider. You may need to do a service substitution. For example, you've applied for a particular piece of equipment, and by the time you get a funding commitment decision, your service provider no longer has the exact model in stock. And so you need to substitute one model of router for another. By way of example, the service substitution is where you can request that change. And then obviously, as I mentioned earlier, you can manage users, manage the organizations, make changes to things like addresses, phone numbers, things like that, as well as discount calculation data. And then you can start invoicing here. We'll also take you back to the USAC website. This one says contact us. This is where you would submit a customer service case. So if I click on customer service, or excuse me, if I click on contact us, you'll see that it takes you directly to creating a customer service case. I will say that for the most part, they are pretty responsive to these. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get an answer to your question. Sometimes they come back and they provide you with a response that really doesn't answer the question. In which case it's sometimes better to, sometimes it's helpful to just have a phone call rather than a written form, but it's also a good way, this is also a good way to reach out and ask questions. Cancel this. Also on your landing page, if you scroll down, it will show you whether you have any pending inquiries. So let's say, for example, you filed a Form 471 and the reviewer of your application has submitted to you a question that asks you for additional information or maybe some documentation. That will show up in your pending inquiries if you haven't responded to it yet. It's a handy, it's really a kind of handy thing to look at or to have available because you can simply log in and take a look and see if there are anything there. And if you see nothing, you can generally move on. We'll also provide you with various notifications if you want to see what notifications you've been provided. For example, this is where you can look at funding commitment decision letters, notifications for various receipt of things that they've asked for in the past, all there. Also lists off each of the entities in your district, and then also it gives you a list of your customer service cases. So if you've issued any customer service cases, the responses will show up here, or actually the case ID will be a link so that you can dig deeper and look at the responses that you've received. And then last but certainly not least, here's where you can search for forms that have been previously submitted. Your general forms are your Form 470, 471, 486, or 500. Note that you just use these drop downs to search. And then let's see, you select a funding year. And now it's going to give you all of the Forms 471 that you submitted for that funding year. Same thing works, it works similarly if you are asking for post-commitment requests. And post-commitment requests include appeals, spin changes, and service substitutions. And that gives you just a brief overview of what's in your Epic portal. This is the place where you will jump off to most of the work that you do in the program. I'm going to stop sharing. I will come back to I believe share. No. Presentation. There we go. And I believe we have basically run the gamut here. And I've already probably carried over a little bit longer than I want to, but that is typical of me, by the way. So just so that you know, if I schedule something for an hour, it's probably going to be an hour and 15 minutes or so. Whoops. Oh. Important things to note just before we're done. You want to make sure that you have access to Epic and that you or somebody in your district has been assigned account administrator privileges. Not everybody can add a new user or make changes to the information about buildings within the district. You need to be an account administrator in order to do that. And only one person within your district can be the account administrator. Now, that having been said, it's probably going to be you. Most cases, you all are going to be the leaders of the E-rate activities that are associated with your district. If you don't have an Epic account and you don't have account administrator privileges, you are definitely going to want to get those assigned to you. And as mentioned previously, that will require a call to client services, 888-203-8100. It's a good number to memorize, by the way. It is also important that you know where to find E-rate documentation from prior years, especially if you are new. Especially if you are new, you want to know where all that stuff is. You may be asked about or to provide documentation for something that has occurred before you arrived in the district. If you are new, there are still things that might be bubbling about in the E-rate world that will come up that you will have to deal with even though you weren't around when it occurred. Now, that having been said, if it does and you need help, reach out. I've said this already a number of times. We are here to help you with that, so we can help you respond to the questions that you get. That having been said, we cannot help you find that documentation if it's documentation that is within the district and specific to the district that doesn't already lie within Epic. So you're going to want to know where like old bills are, contracts, old information about the competitive bidding process for any contracts that you are currently still working with. As you see on the next bullet, the document retention schedule is 10 years from the last date to receive service, which means that if you have a contract that's a 5-year contract, you actually have to keep the contract related information for 10 years after the last day to receive services under that contract. So you literally could be keeping that documentation for 16 years before you no longer have to retain it. I know that sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but that should give you a sense of the extent to which you need to have access to that documentation from prior years. At any time, you could be audited. You could be put into what's referred to as PQA, which is a payment quality assurance. These are all different kinds of reviews to make sure that these federal funds are not being misused and so on and so forth. So you want to proactively be prepared for that, and knowing where to find old documentation is of critical importance. Hopefully you've been working with someone within your district who has at least helped share with you where you can begin to look for those bits of documents. And then last but not least, put in a absolutely shameless plug to make sure that you can, if at all possible, either attend or afterwards review the trainings for Form 470, 471. I'll throw in their discount data, eligible services. Next week, we're going to look at some new eligible services. Anytime there's training that's made available to you, I highly encourage you to take the time to attend and or watch the results, look at the PowerPoints, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that I've turned the fire hose on, and I apologize for that. I'm not sure that there's really any way other than to kind of just throw it out there, and then hopefully you can begin to wrap your head around it. And then as you get into the E-rate experience directly, do not, please do not hesitate to call, email. We're happy to help you in any way that we can. And I will then, we will throw it over to questions and answers. Well, hopefully we'll have answers. I'm going to stop sharing, and unfortunately you have to look at me when that happens, but any questions? Again, I know I've thrown opened up the fire hose, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you start diving in, and then you'll need the help, and that's fine. It's not a problem. All right. Well, then, hearing none, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. And if you have any questions going forward, again, please don't hesitate to ask. We are here to help make this experience as effective and helpful for you as absolutely possible.